My next guest is Hannah Freed, co-founder and executive director of All Voting is Local and All Voting is Local Action. All Voting is Local is a nonpartisan organization that seeks to make voting safe, fair, and accessible for all. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Yes, and happy Women's History Month. It's great to chat with women leaders like you who are making so much progress in the space that you work with. And just to start on that note, you work with protecting, voters' rights and, the protection to be able to safely cast a ballot without intimidation. What would you say, just a scene setter for our viewers, is the greatest threat to American voting right now in terms of voter suppression?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And it's, it is one that I'm answering differently now than I probably would have a few years ago. We say a lot at our organization that we got into this work because we wanted to, fight polling place closures in communities of color. We wanted to make sure that voters had safe and easy access to voter registration and voting in person and vote by mail. That is still the case, right? Those threats are still very present, particularly for Black and Brown voters, Native American voters, others who've been historically kind of left out, pushed out of the voting process. But in this moment, I think that the threat of election denial, questioning of election results for no good reason, right? Without basis, without foundation, this kind of reliance on conspiracy theories to make policies, right? That is a true and existential threat. And I think we've really seen that in the evolution of our work. And I think it's the moment that we're in right now.
Yeah, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on some of these figures. Most of them do, or at least all of them, I believe, come from the conservative or Republican side of the aisle. When we talk about this issue with, for example, Kari Lake, she was a gubernatorial candidate in Arizona last cycle, and she has still yet to concede that race. Critics from the left would say that, maybe to a lesser extent, but at the same time, Stacey Abrams, or critics from the right, would say that Stacey Abrams was pushing an unfair, unfair narrative that she actually won the election in Georgia in 2018. But with these figures like Kari Lake, for example, these are figures that are very much on the rise in conservative politics. She won the straw poll at CPAC to be, President Trump's vice presidential pick, or the Republican ticket's vice presidential pick. How concerned are you that there are these leaders who are really much garnering or gaining a following and continuing to be on the rise like this?
Sure. So, I think the way that we think about it, I'll say, we're a nonpartisan org, right? But, I think the thing that we're really interested in is what is the kind of environment in which voters are going to cast their ballots, right? And if voters are going to cast their ballots in an environment in which leaders at the highest levels, right, the highest levels of government in some cases, right, whether it's state government or certainly in 2020, the White House, are relying on kind of propagating disinformation, lies about the ways that our elections are run, that creates an environment in which voters start to feel like, okay, my vote isn't going to count. And I don't know if I even want to vote. And that is where we really, from our organizational perspective, that's really where we start to worry. What we want to see is elections officials, candidates who are accepting election results, right? I mean, that is the baseline on which our kind of democracy is built. And I think, you asked me at the start, sort of like, what have we seen change? I think there are certain things that we all used to be able to agree on. I don't think that's the case anymore. Yeah. And I think our system is really being pressure tested, right? Because it wasn't built for these kind of outlier cases, right? Where you've got people absolutely for months refusing to concede. I will say, I do want to kind of push a little on the notion that, drawing comparisons, between everybody who kind of questions the fairness of our system. I mean, we question the fairness of our system all the time. Voter suppression is real. Black voters, Latino voters, Native American voters have, since this country's founding, faced, in some cases, outright prohibitions on voting. And then over time, hurdles to accessing the ballot box. Those threats are real, right? And the intention of those, right? What motivates them, what motivates creating those barriers can be racism, it can be power grabs, and it's ugly no matter what it comes down to. But I think that what we're talking about here with this threat of the questioning of election results, goes to something much more fundamental, much more existential. And it is scary. It is a new thing for our country to be facing. I will say, coming out of 2022, I think we have reason for optimism that this may not be here to stay. It may go back to the margins where it belongs, but it is a real and existential threat that we have to continue to activate against.
Right, right. And I think that's really interesting that you bring that up, because as a reporter, you ask Republicans about this issue. The first person they bring up, like I said, was Stacey Abrams. On the left, you ask them about this issue. They bring up figures like Kari Lake. Clearly can't compare, apples and oranges there. So how do we get past this being a partisan issue? I mean, because I think it's just become, unfortunately, a very partisan issue. And, it's all about, it's just become politics as normal. So how do we get past that narrative?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm an eternal optimist, I would say. There was a time not so long ago where there actually was a lot of common ground to be found here, right? I mean, if you think about the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, about 15 years ago, right? There has been bipartisanship in how we approach sort of fundamentals of voter access. That is not where we are now, right? But I will say, as I mentioned a minute ago, I think coming out of 2022, I think we really did see a repudiation of election denial. And I don't just mean electorally, although, there's been plenty of commentary about that too. I mean, in the way that votes were counted, right? We saw elections officials stand up and say, I'm going to follow the law here, right? And these are the facts, and I'm going to stick with them. And that is what we need to continue to see. And I think voters supported that. Voters certainly turned out to ensure that their votes would count. And I think it is that kind of, bravery, frankly, but that will blaze a trail for us forward, just like it did in 2022.
Right, absolutely. And I want to talk about, sort of growing voter turnout and, making it more accessible. Stacey Abrams did do an incredible job in 2020 at making sure more voters of color, more women, more voters who, had trouble getting to certain polling places and such, that they were able to vote. And it did end up making a difference. How can we see that system replicated throughout the country? I mean, can you take that blueprint in Georgia and expand it across the country?
Yeah, and it's not limited to Georgia, though certainly there too. I mean, we saw even in, this past election, we saw big gains. Michigan voters passed Proposition 2, which expanded access to vote by mail. It expanded access to early voting, right? These are, voters show that this is what they want. They show it through their votes, like with Proposition 2 in Michigan, and they show it with their actions, right? Voters use these options when they are available to them on both sides of the aisle, I'll say, right? I mean, that's why some of this stuff is so wild. Vote by mail is wildly popular. People used it in the pandemic, certainly, but people have used it for decades at this point. And voters of all kinds, of all stripes, right? So I think that, if we are actually looking at what it is that voters want, I think that is really our guide. That's also what our organization is really about, is really ensuring that elections officials are listening to, hearing from, and listening to the communities that they're supposed to serve. And when you do that, I mean, that is actually how you get a more inclusive system of registration and voting and vote counting.
Right. And my final question to you is definitely more of a personal one. You are a Ukrainian American woman. Ever since Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year, you have seen so many Ukrainians on the forefront, Volodymyr Zelensky to name one, but you've also seen a lot of Ukrainian women. You hear the stories of Olena Zelenska, the First Lady of Ukraine, what she's doing to, sort of galvanize her people and such during this time of war. And you've seen just the incredible strength of Ukrainians, but particularly Ukrainian women, mothers, daughters, sisters. I wanted to get your take from a personal side, what it's been like for you and your family to watch this conflict, but see so many women who share your heritage really coming to the forefront like never before.
I really appreciate the question. I mean, I talk about my mother is Ukrainian American, and, my grandparents immigrated to this country. And I mean, it is a source of enormous pride for Ukrainian Americans. I mean, I think people were so astounded watching the early coverage of just how bold Ukrainians were in response to the invasion. And for our family watching that, we were like, I mean, yeah, what did you expect? This is how Ukrainians show up. This is what my mother is like. This is what my grandmother was like. This is what our family identifies as. And so it really is just a moment of incredible pride. And, accompanying this profound sorrow of seeing something like this happen yet again to the country that we come from. But it is really extraordinary to see the persistence and the bravery among Ukrainians, Ukrainian women, and Ukrainian people generally.
Yeah, it really is extraordinary, and to see that even reflected in this country across the world. Hannah Fried, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.